Hello and welcome to this week's unit, Research Ethics. So we start with this question of why are ethics important? Why do we need to consider ethical issues when we are conducting research? There's a few reasons for this. Occasionally, manipulations that we engage with in our research may be harmful or produce undesirable experiences for our participants. Depicted here is the famous Stanley Milgram experiment, which we'll talk about. Um, some experiments involve deceiving participants, not giving them full information. So, for example, a cyberball is a task that was developed to manipulate and study the effects of social exclusion. And in this game, the participants are told that they're playing ball with two other participants. And what happens is um, they are randomly assigned to either get the ball thrown to them, their little avatar, equal numbers of times, or they're just completely excluded from the ball tossing game. And what they don't know is that there are no other participants. Those are just computer programs. And so sometimes we have to deceive people. Sometimes we study private information. So researchers who are interested in psychological disorders or sexual behavior, this is private information. And then oftentimes we include control conditions. So, for example, in order to do a true experiment on an educational intervention, we may have to provide the intervention to one group of students while withholding it from another, and there are ethical concerns there. And then there's also an inherent power differential between the experimenter and the participant um, that needs to be considered and addressed. So this all really started with the Nazis. Um, During the end of World War II, just prior to World War II, there were no restrictions on research at all. It was literally the Wild West of research. People could do almost anything in the name of research without any sort of oversight. Um, then along come the Nazis, and the Nazis did terrible things in the name of research. So, shooting people with poison bullets to figure out more effective ways of killing people, or, putting people into hot air balloons and letting them go up to super high altitudes to, learn about how the human body how much the human body can withstand when it comes to altitude. And ultimately, this all led to the Nuremberg Code, which is sort of a set of guidelines for ethical research. But there was still no oversight to research. There was sort of like this set of guidelines, like you guys should probably adhere to. There was no oversight. And then along come some other ethically dubious studies. So in the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, researchers allowed men who were infected with syphilis to effectively die of the disease so that they could study the progression of the disease. They effectively withheld life-saving treatments. And I may be getting this wrong. I don't recall specifically if this is true, but it's also my understanding that they might have even been telling them that they were treating them even though they weren't, to observe the course of the disease. Don't quote me on that one. I'm not 100% sure. Then there's the Milgram obedience experiment. So if you've taken any psychology classes, you may have run across this before. This link is to a YouTube video. I encourage you, if you're interested, to watch these videos. It gives you some insight into how these experiments were conducted. But the short version of this story is that participants were led to believe that as part of the experiment, they had to shock someone in another room. And every time they shocked someone, they had to increase the voltage to the point where the person in the other room is screaming and then silent, presumably dead or unconscious. And the experimenter told the participants that they had to continue shocking this person in the other room. Now, there was no one in the other room. All the screaming was a tape recording, and the study was really about obedience to authority, again, sort of in the wake of these terrible atrocities committed by the Nazis. But when you watch the videos of these participants, they're clearly experiencing psychological distress from participating in this study. And this is ethically sort of questionable. There's also the Stanford Prison Experiment, another quite unethical study that ultimately launched the career of a famous psychologist named Philip Zimbardo. In the Stanford Prison Experiment, they set up a prison in the basement of Stanford University and randomly assigned participants to either be guards or prisoners, and then kept them there for 2 weeks and simulated a prison. And towards the middle and end of that study, the prisoners were on a hunger strike and revolting, and the guards were treating them terribly. It was a horribly unethical experiment. But again, we learned quite a lot, but unethical. So we have all these unethical experiments. People are becoming aware of the need for oversight, and this leads to the development of the Institutional Review Board. There's a federally mandated system that's designed to protect the rights and welfare of human participants. It's usually made up of committee members. It can vary from institution to institution. I'm not 100% sure how it's set up at Loyola University, but I know that at Chicago State University, it's made up of a committee of faculty members. At DePaul University, they have an entire department of professionals who just do the IRB. And the function of the IRB is to protect the rights of human participants and to review research protocols. For institutions that have animal research, there is a separate review board for the animal research. Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee protects the rights and welfare of the animal participants. It also is made up of committee members. And not only does it cover review of the research that's going to be conducted, but it also includes the care and treatment of the animals. So why do we have the IRB? What does the IRB do for us? The IRB provides an independent evaluation of research. So the goal here is for researchers to have to submit their research plans to an independent entity that's going to evaluate the costs and benefits of the research project, specifically to the participants and society and the institution. And really what the IRB's main focus is, is this research worth it? Like, is the research set up in such a way that it's going to produce usable information? Are the benefits of knowing this information greater than the risks to the participants? Now, when we talk about risks in research, there are a few different types of research that we're interested in. So physical risks. You can be physically hurt during a research study. So, for example, when I was an undergraduate, there was a researcher at my university who was doing a study for NASA on motion sickness, and it involved drinking a semi-disgusting liquid and then getting into this giant spinning drum, like similar to what you see depicted here, and then you sit in this drum and then the whole thing starts to spin. And in the department at the time, it was sort of a notorious experiment for making people vomit. And there is a risk inherent in having people vomit in your lab, right? Not just the vomiting themselves, but they could slip and fall, they could choke. There's a lot of risks involved in that kind of study. So there can be physical risks. There can be psychological or social risks. So, for example, I did some research on the effects of apologies on forgiveness, and I had people in that study, right about a time when someone you were in a relationship with hurt you in some way and they remorsefully apologized. And then after the participants wrote about that experience, they answered some questions about it. And most of the participants wrote about, relatively benign things. My boyfriend said he was supposed to pick me up my boyfriend was supposed to pick me up, and he was late because he was out with his friends, and that made me upset, and then he apologized. But some of the participants recalled particularly stressful, difficult situations. My ex-husband grabbed me by the hair and threw me down a flight of stairs, right? So asking participants to recall that leads to the potential for psychological stress. You can also have social stress. So, if you're asking people demographic information and you need to know their sexual orientation, there's potential that someone might identify as bisexual or homosexual or lesbian, but may not be out. And so asking that question, is potentially, leading to a social risk for that person. Now, as researchers, we are ethically obligated to protect all of our participants from risk. And how we define that risk is relative to this idea of what we call minimal risk. So minimal risk is harm or discomfort that is not greater than what you experience in everyday life during routine physical and psychological tests. AKA, minimal risk is risk that is not greater than what you would experience just walking around in your life. If you have to walk upstairs to get to part of my research study, walking upstairs is a risk, right? You could fall, you could hit your face, you could hurt yourself, but it's not greater than minimal risk because people walk upstairs every single day, right? This is something that people experience in their day-to-day life. Now, this is sort of inherently relative and subjective, right? So what one person experiences in their day-to-day life is not necessarily the same as what another person does, right? If you're doing a study on exercise, for example, and you need people to run 1 mile on a treadmill, for some people that might be minimal risk, right? That might be what they experience in their day-to-day life. For other people, not so much, right? And it also can depend on the population, right? So if we're looking at the effects of dieting on weight loss for college students, and we're going to cut 100 calories or 200 calories from their diet, that might be minimal risk because that's something that people do engage in. But if we're looking at that with a group of children typically don't go on a diet, and so that would be greater than minimal risk. But the key here is that when we are putting together an application to the IRB, we need to think about all of the risks that our participants might possibly experience as being part of our study, and whether or not that risk is greater than minimal risk. Now, when the risks are greater than minimal risk, we say that this is at risk, and this increases our ethical obligation to protect participants' welfare. So, for example, in my forgiveness study, where there was the potential for people to recall and experience psychological stress from an event relating to being harmed in some way by a relationship partner, I had to put in place a variety of procedures to help to mitigate that risk. So the participants completed the study in the presence of the researcher, and I had a set of procedures for how to deal with participants who were experiencing psychological stress or harm. So I had to observe them looking for symptoms or signs of this, and I had to have a script for what I would say if someone experienced psychological harm, ultimately leading up to offering to walk them to the counseling services center at that university. So we're obligated to protect our participants' welfare. One way we can do this is by considering alternative methods. Is there a different way we could do this that would lower risk? Another way is increasing confidentiality, particularly for social risk, right? The person who is not out but is going to potentially identify themselves as gay or lesbian on your survey. Well, if you don't collect any identifying information, then the risk that that information could get connected with their identity is decreased pretty substantially. And And again, when we report this, we can increase confidentiality by not actually reporting individual level data, right? We talk about averages and frequencies, these kinds of things. One thing to be aware of is that anonymity is not the same as confidentiality. Confidentiality means that it is impossible for your anonymity means it is completely impossible for your responses to be associated with your identity. Completely impossible. So if you imagine that you have a survey that's at a booth at the mall and there's no one around and people just take the survey and drop it into a box and they don't put any identifying information on there, it's nearly impossible for you to identify who those people are, right? Short of like getting a handwriting expert and FBI level resources, it would be really difficult for you to connect those responses to that person. That's anonymity. Now, confidentiality means that there is not information connected to that participant. You're not collecting their information, but it is possible that you could connect their responses to their identity. So you can imagine course evaluations are confidential, right? So when I get course evaluations, let's say there's 30 students in a class, I'm not able to necessarily look at the course evaluation and say, oh, that's obviously this person, but it is possible that if I spent a lot of time and tried to figure it out based on the information I had, that I could potentially connect that. So the key here is that anonymity means it's impossible to connect identifying information with your research results. Confidentiality means it's difficult, but not impossible. Now, there's different levels of review when we're putting together an IRB application, right, when we want to do a study. Non-review are research that are related or for classroom-related activities. So if I have you guys in my research methods class go out and collect some data for a study, an example study that we're doing, which I won't do for you guys, but I have done in the past for other classes, that classifies as non-review, right? It's just for educational purposes. But let's say I did do that and I had you guys collect some cool data and we found some really cool results. We couldn't publish those results because they are not reviewed by IRB, right? They're only strictly for educational purposes. Archival data, anything that's publicly available data, you don't need to get IRB review for. And even if it's privately available data, and there's some formal agreement with the person who holds that data, like let's say that a school system is going to give you some data on some students, but there is no possible way that you can identify who those students are. This might, especially if it's archival data, this might classify as non-review. The next level of review is exempt review. Now, one thing to know about these levels of review, as we're increasing the level of review, we're increasing the degree of scrutiny that these IRB applications are going to receive. Right? So for non-review, you don't have to put in an application at all. Exempt review is saying, I'm doing this study, but there is no more than minimal risk, right? So we're not asking anything too out of the ordinary. We're not having participants do anything too out of the ordinary. Normal settings, normal educational practices. And it's going to be completely anonymous. We can't connect these people in any way. Then this would classify as exempt review. So for example, I'm currently doing a research study where I'm interested in parking behavior. This idea that there's some evidence, there's a pretty strong evidence that people take longer to pull out of a parking spot when someone is waiting for it compared to when no one is waiting for it. And so I'm doing some research where we're going out and we're gathering some more information, but we're observing people's parking behavior in parking lots. And this is an exempt level review study, right? It's no more than minimal risk. It's people interacting in the real world. And we're not asking any identifying information. We're not like taking their pictures. We're not video recording or anything like that. And so this counts as exempt level review. Now, there are some exceptions to exempt review. There are certain populations that cannot qualify for exempt or expedited review. They must go to full board review. We'll talk about those in a minute. But just know that any research you're doing with children, prisoners, or people who might have social, emotional, mental disabilities, those populations are not, any research you're doing with those populations does not qualify for exempt review. Now, expedited review is the next level up. Again, no more than minimal risk, but now we're having a little bit more of a direct contact with our participants. So we're not talking about an online survey or me sitting in a car observing people's parking behavior. We're talking about actually interacting with people. So perhaps, we're asking people, having them step on a scale and record their weight, or perhaps we're doing some kind of neurological study where we're recording brain waves, and we have to have them come in and sit down and have research assistants put electrodes on their scalp or something like that. We're having direct contact with participants. And again, we're not asking them to do anything out of the ordinary, but because we're having direct contact with them, and they are not necessarily completely anonymous, right? So if you're running this research study at Loyola and you're doing this brain research study and someone comes in, it's possible that they know the research assistant. So it's not completely anonymous. Then it qualifies as expedited. Any of these examples here, surveys, interviews, oral histories, all of these things tend to fall under expedited review. The last level of review is full board review. So this is any research that doesn't qualify as exempt or expedited. It's the highest level of review. It can involve more than minimal risk. So for example, that forgiveness study where people are writing about a time when someone hurt them and they apologize, that was a full review. This takes the longest to process this application. If you're interested in, sexual stuff or personal or sensitive information, if the participants are children, you always have to get full board review. I always tell my students that working with children, doing research with children is tremendously difficult because there are many layers of review that you have to go through in order to use children as participants in your research study. Now, one of the principles of research participation, and this comes out of the Nuremberg Code, is that research participation must be voluntary, right? Participants must be volunteering to participate in the research that you are doing, and you are not allowed, it is unethical to coerce people into research participation, right? To sort of trick them in some way. Now, this is one of the reasons why prisoners and people with psychological disorders are considered special populations because people in these kinds of settings may not necessarily understand that their participation is voluntary. If you think of a prisoner, for example, they spend their entire day being told what to do. And so if a researcher comes in and asks them, would you like to participate in the study, they may not fully understand that they can say no without any negative repercussions. Ethics should also not influence who's recruited, right? So we should be trying to have representative samples. This is a problem in the field of psychology, where traditionally in the field of psychology, the traditional participant is a straight white male. Now, this has changed in the last maybe 2 decades, but for the first 30 years of that field, we were basically doing research on straight white men. And this is problematic because, how can we be certain that what patterns emerge for this group will generalize to these other groups? So ideally, we would want our study to ethically have a representative sample from whatever population we're working with. Now, in order to volunteer for something, you kind of need to know what you're getting yourself into, right? And this is one of the other principles of research, of ethical research, which is informed consent. Participants, when they are agreeing to be in your study, need to be given all of the information about that study in advance so that they can make an informed decision whether or not to participate. They need to know what they're going to do. They need to know what the possible risks are. Now, for some studies, you are required to get written informed consent. So, for example, my son, who is 6 years old now and at the time was about 3 years old, participated in some research at Loyola, and we were given an informed consent sheet where we read through everything that was going to happen in the study, and we consented to allow him to participate in this research. One of the reasons why working with children is so difficult is you need to get consent of the parents, so you've got to coordinate that. Written informed consent is not required for exempt and expedited studies, especially when the written informed consent document, the signature, is the only thing that links the person's identity to their responses. So in those cases, typically, instead of doing informed consent, you give, instead of having written informed consent, you get oral informed consent and you give them an information sheet that describes everything that they're going to do in the studies. Obviously, this is not required when we're observing public behavior where people don't even know that they're being part of a study. Now, there's a couple key pieces of informed consent. So they need to know all the aspects of the research, and they also need to know that they can withdraw their consent at any time without penalty, and you as a researcher are not allowed to put pressure on them to continue if they decide they are done. So, for example, my son, in that research, those researchers were looking at distractibility as it relates to TV, and so they asked my son, would you like to, come play with some toys? And of course he was like, sure, I'll go play with some toys. And he went into this room and he was randomly assigned to one of three conditions where a TV came on and it was either showing the news or Sesame Street or nothing. And they were sort of interested in how he continued working on puzzles in the presence of this distractor and that kind of thing. Now, if my son at some point in the middle of that study had started getting upset and said, I don't want to do this, where's my dad, right? That's withdrawing his assent to participate in the study. Notice I said assent, not consent. We'll talk about that. He's withdrawing his assent to participate in the study, and the researcher at that time has to end that study, right? You cannot pressure people to continue. And the participant has to understand, right? And this is one of the reasons why working with children, again, is so difficult. Young children cannot give consent. Consent is a legal thing. You have to be 18 in most states to give consent. So in order to use children research, you need to get the consent of their parents or guardians and their assent, right? Their agreement to participate. Now, sometimes, not typically in educational research, I think I've mentioned before, I'm a social psychologist, and in social psychology, all we do is deceive people. But sometimes it's important to deceive people, to withhold information from the participants, because having that information will influence the way that they behave in the study. So, for example, most people are motivated to not appear prejudiced. And so if I'm doing a study where I'm interested in studying your prejudice, if I tell you, hey, this study is to figure out how prejudiced you are towards African Americans, that's going to influence how you respond in that study, right? So sometimes it is important to deceive people, to withhold information about a study. Now, the only time it is not okay to deceive people is if the reason for the deception is to get them to participate in the first place, right? So, for example, in this Rice 1971 study, it's an example of this deception for participation. He was interested in studying police brutality and police the way the police interacted with the public. But in order to get the kind of access to observe police engaging in this kind of behavior, um, he deceived the officers in the department and told them he was interested in studying the public. And so he told them the focus of the study was the public, not the police. And so this raises this ethical issue of, it's certainly not okay to deceive people in order to get them to participate. You can imagine that many of those police officers wouldn't have agreed to participate in this research if they'd have known that it was their behavior that was being observed. But it raises this larger question of, like, how is it possible to have informed consent if you're deceiving people? Right? One of the principles is that people should know what they're getting themselves into. How do you have that? The reason why we deceive is that when you know the true purpose of the study, it influences how you behave, right? So if knowing what the study is about will change the kind of data we get from you, right? If it makes you try to respond in a socially desirable as opposed to an honest fashion, then it can be okay to deceive. It also can sometimes allow us to observe people's natural behavior, as opposed to, you can think about this sort of like social monitoring behavior. Socially unacceptable things are difficult to study without deception, right? So if you're interested in people's prejudice towards people who are obese, right, it's not acceptable to be prejudiced, and yet we know that people are. And so oftentimes these are instances where deception can be okay. Now, there's problems. Obviously, it contradicts the principle of informed consent, and this relationship between the researcher and participants is not open and honest, and it makes people suspicious, especially in psychology. Now, again, most of the research that people in the field of education are going to be doing isn't going to necessarily involve much deception, but it's important to know, especially if you are reading research articles in psychology, or if you end up dabbling in psychological research. One example that I have of this sort of suspicion piece was that when I was an undergraduate, I participated in one of those EEG studies where they glued electrodes to my head, and then they put me in this pitch black room, and I was looking at a green computer screen and responding to these words with buttons. And about 30 minutes into the study, I started wondering to myself, I wonder if this study is about like how long I'll just sit here and keep doing this, right? I was like, I didn't buy like what they told me that the study was about these words. I was like, maybe they're just waiting to see how long I'll stay here. So then I like got up and I left, and I was like, what's going on? Do you guys want me to keep going? And they're like, yes, keep going, right? And I probably messed up their data by getting up and moving around with these electrodes on my head, right? But the idea is that because I was aware that psychologists deceive people when they do research studies, it made me suspicious. Now, when you put together your IRB application, if you're deceiving your participants in any way, you have to justify it. You have to explain to the IRB, this is why we're doing this. This is why it's important. There are no other ways that we can test this hypothesis to get this data without this deception. So, for example, if I was doing a study on eyewitness testimony, and so I had participants in a big room filling out a survey, and then someone ran in and stole something off the table and ran out. And then I wanted to know, like, what did the participants see? How accurate was their testimony? Was their witnessing of this crime? But if I told them in advance what was going to happen, that would completely alter the responses that I got, right? You want people to be experiencing this the way they would in real life. And in real life, you're not going to know that someone's going to come in and rob the bank, right? So this is a case where deception is justified, right? The only way to get this real life experience of this phenomena is to deceive them and not tell them this piece of the study. But again, the deception cannot influence people's decision to participate, right? So I have the sort of gross example. If you're a company and you're studying the effectiveness of some anti-diarrheal medicine, and part of that research study involves having people to have diarrhea, right? It's kind of important to know that that's part of the study because that information would probably affect your willingness to participate, right? So if the information that you're withholding would affect people's decision to participate in the study or not, that is the unethical deception. If it's just more information about the study that wouldn't influence the decision either way, but would influence largely the outcome of the study, then deception can be justified. Now, when we use deception, we have to inform the participants for the reason for the deception and discuss misconceptions and remove harmful effects. We call this debriefing. So at the end of the study, we have to tell the whole truth to the participants and tell them everything that they need to know and answer all of their questions, right? Ideally, the students, the participants, should have learned something through the participation in the study, and they should leave with a positive experience, right? We want them to leave with at least a neutral experience, if not a positive one. Now, a brief note about ethical standards for use with animals. There is this other board, the IACUC, where they deal with research applications having to do with animal research. Researchers are ethically obligated to protect the welfare of animal subjects, minimize discomfort, and treat animals as humanely as possible, must be supervised by experienced personnel. It is tremendously more difficult, and there is tremendously more regulations involved with animal research. Researchers have to justify any pain, discomfort. They have to justify any time that they have to euthanize an animal for these scientific, educational, and applied goals. And there are just some instances where we need to do this to learn, about how things work. So, for example, we might be interested in knowing what kind of changes happen in the brain when people learn a task. And we can't physically kill people and dissect their brains to figure out what happened. But we can do that with laboratory mice, as long as we do it in a humane way. The other thing to know about animals that are used in research, the animals that are used in research are not animals that people just collect off of the streets. There's literally a catalog of rats where you can order genetically engineered animals for your research. You want a rat that is going to grow breast cancer cells so you can study the effects of particular breast cancer treatments, right? You could order that particular rat. So these are not animals that are even suited or able to live in the wild, right? They're bred and created specifically for research. And 99% of the time, they are treated in the most ethical and humane way possible. Of course, the pictures that you see on the internet are that 1% of the time where people are behaving unethically. One last note about this too. In the U.S., 6.5 million animals are killed each year. 0.3% of them are used in research. So as a function of animal deaths, research with animals is very, very tiny. When we report research, we need to be ethical in how we report our research. This is a problem in psychology, but it's also a problem which you may or may not have been aware of. But it's a problem in all fields, sort of varying from the worst case, the case of Diederik Stapel, who was a famous psychologist, until one day people started looking into the results of his studies and discovered that he had completely fabricated or made up all of his data. And his career was immediately over, right? So this is an extreme case of unethical behavior in research. But massaging the data can also be sort of unethical, or doing 15 studies but only reporting the one where the hypothesis was supported. Right? It's also kind of unethical. Obviously, fairly acknowledging those who contribute to a research project, which we talked about in the last unit, and also plagiarism, which we also talked about in the last unit, are also issues, ethical issues when we're talking about reporting psychological research and reporting educational. That is it for this unit's lecture on ethics. As always, let me know if you have any questions or concerns.